Good morning. So you consider stand however you're comfortable. Just bring. Perfect. Thank you. All right, Mr. Lally, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you please state your name and spell your last name for the record?
Sure. Matthew Kelly, Kelly.
And what is it that you do for work, sir?
I'm a firefighter paramedic for Canton Fire.
And how long have you been a firefighter paramedic with Canton Fire?
Approximately 2.5 years.
And prior to working for the Canton Fire Department, what any other employment did you have within that sort of field?
I worked for a private ambulance, Braintree ambulance service for approximately 5 months.
And sort of geographically, where was that located?
Boston area.
Now, prior to you working as an EMT or a paramedic, you worked as an EMT before working as a paramedic?
Correct.
Okay. And so prior to working as either an EMT or a paramedic, did you have any sort of training or did you receive any sort of certification in regard to being an EMT paramedic?
Yeah, so I had to do a 6-month EMT course, and then I had to do a practical and written exam for the course, and then for the state to get my EMT. And then for a paramedic school, it was about a 10 to 12-month didactic portion. And then I did I believe it was 200 hours clinical in the hospitals. And then I did 300 hours ride time. And then I had to do a practical and written exam for the course and also for the state. And now with Canton Fire, I'm getting precepted as a paramedic.
And when you use that term as far as precepted, what exactly does that term mean within your
It just means that you get trained by an experienced paramedic for an extended period of time until they say that you can do the job on your own.
And with regard to being a EMT and a paramedic, you receive a certification in regard to working within that field?
Can you say that again?
With regard to being an EMT and a paramedic, to receive some sort of certification either from the state or some other body in regard to working in that field?
Yes.
You have certification in regard to both?
Yes.
And is that certification up to date at this point?
Yes, it is.
Sir, if I could turn your attention to January 28th, the evening of that, into January 29th, 2022. Were you working with the Canton Fire Department that day?
Yes, I was.
Do you recall what kind of shift you were working on that day?
24-hour shift on the ambulance.
And which station house were you assigned to on that day?
Station 1.
And that's located where within the town of Canton?
99 Revere Street.
And you were assigned to the ambulance, is that correct?
Correct.
And who, if anyone else from your department, was assigned to the ambulance along with you?
Paramedic Anthony Fulmati.
And on that morning of January 29th, do you recall about what time that you woke up on that day?
I believe it was about 4:45 a.m.
And when you woke up, what, if anything, is it that you did with regard to your duties and responsibilities around fire station?
So we woke up a little bit early to shovel off the apron, shovel off the parking lot, and just prepare for the new shift coming in.
And just briefly, sir, so when you go outside to shovel, what, if anything, do you recall about sort of the weather conditions and what they were at that moment?
There was snow on the ground, it was snowing, high winds, low visibility, still dark out.
Did you recall being dispatched to a call shortly after 6 a.m.?
Yes, I do.
And what was that call, or what was that dispatch in regard to, and where specifically were you dispatched?
It was unresponsive male in the snow on Fairview Road.
And that area of Fairview Road, through your work with Canton Fire Department, are you familiar with that specific area?
Yes.
And you respond in the ambulance, is that correct?
Correct.
Who, if anyone, goes along in the ambulance with you?
Fulmati was in the passenger seat, and then paramedic Tim Nuttall was in the back.
And who was driving?
I was driving.
And in addition to the ambulance, ambulance 1 that you were in, what, if any, other sort of vehicles or apparatus responded from your station to Fairview Road?
We also had an engine and our shift commander SUV.
And if you recall, who was the shift commander in the SUV?
Shift commander was Captain Wendell Robery at the time.
And Captain Robery is now the chief of the Canton Fire, is that correct?
Correct.
And as far as the engine was concerned, who, if anyone, was assigned to the engine and responded to the call as well?
It was Lieutenant Greg Woodbury, firefighter paramedic Katie McLaughlin, and firefighter paramedic Frank Walsh.
And as you're driving from the station house to Fairview, what, if anything, do you recall about the weather conditions, visibility, anything like that along the way?
Just heavy snow and wind, real low visibility, good amount of snow on the ground, so I was just trying to take it slow so we didn't spin out or drift or anything like that.
And can you describe for the jury sort of the route that you took from the station on Revere Street to Fairview Road that morning?
Yeah, we took a right onto Revere Street, left onto Sherman Street, right onto Chapman Street, and then a left onto Fairview.
And as you're driving down Fairview, what, if anything, can you tell the jury about sort of the elevation of that roadway as you go from Chapman down to where you stopped?
It was a pretty steep, long road downhill. It was probably downhill for half of the way through Fairview. And because of that, I was just trying to go real slow, so we didn't drift down the hill.
And one last question about driving, but as you're driving along, what, if anything, else did you observe as far as sort of other vehicular traffic on the roadway, any other cars, trucks, anything like that?
Nothing until I saw the police cruiser at the scene.
And so as you're approaching the scene and you're driving towards it, what, if anything, sort of first draws your attention to where you're going and where you stop?
So it was just real low visibility, but we could see blue lights at the time, so just kept going towards the blue lights and knew that it would be in that area.
Now, where do you stop in relation to the cruiser?
I believe they were facing towards us, so we would be in front of them.
And at some point, you're being dispatched for an unresponsive male part, correct?
Correct.
And so when you're pulling up to the scene, you see the cruiser, are you able to also see any sort of unresponsive male part?
Not when I'm in the truck. I had to get out of the truck to see.
And when was it, and how far away from it were you at the first time that you observed the unresponsive man?
Once I got out of the truck, I was probably had to be about like 5 feet away until I could see the victim.
And at this time when you're arriving, sometime shortly after 6 a.m., is it light out, dark out, or something else?
It's dark.
And just so we can stop saying unresponsive now, at some point you identified who the patient was that you eventually treated and transported. And who did you identify him?
Mr. O'Keefe.
The John O'Keefe, is that correct?
Correct.
So you get out of the vehicle. You all get out at the same time, is that correct?
Relatively, yeah.
And where is it that you, firefighter Kamadi and firefighter Null, go?
So we first go to pick up some of the bags and stuff that we would need to conduct an arrest, and then we just go straight over to the body and some people that were around there.
And with regard to the bags that you retrieved, what kind of bags are we talking?
We take like a first-in bag that has miscellaneous stuff. We take an airway bag, and we would take a cardiac monitor.
And can you indicate, as far as where Mr. O'Keefe was, who, if anyone else, or what, if any other people were in that same area?
Could you say that one more time?
When you first go over to where Mr. O'Keefe is, who, if anyone, or how many other people are in that general area? When you
Sure. I remember seeing a police officer and 2 women.
And as far as where Mr. O'Keefe was, first of all, how was he positioned in relation to the ground?
He was on his back, probably about around a fire hydrant, probably about 5 or so feet from what I saw would be the street.
So you believe about 5 or so feet in from the road, correct?
Correct.
Now, with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, when you first come over, what, if anything, did you observe as far as snow on him or around him or in the area where he was?
I don't really recall.
Do you recall how Mr. O'Keefe was dressed when you first get over there?
I believe he was wearing a hoodie, like a sweatshirt, and jeans, and remember he had one shoe on, but forget which shoe it was.
You don't recall which shoe it was, but there was one shoe on his foot at that point?
Correct.
And when you first arrive at this station, at Mr. O'Keefe, what is it that you and the other firefighters are doing in regard to the treatment of that?
So the other firefighters were checking for a pulse, and then after that, while I was getting some of the supplies, and then we would start compressions and start moving them into the ambulance so we could get a better look at them and what we were doing.
When you say start compressions, what kind of compressions are you referring to?
CPR.
Chest compressions,
Yes.
correct? And based on your training experience, is there some sort of protocol as to how long one individual should be doing chest compressions?
So we want early and continuous chest compressions for as long as the person is pulseless. We will take breaks in order to check for a pulse and check for any rhythm changes.
And so when breaks are taken, is that one person that's doing those same compressions the entire time, or is it switched off or something else?
We try to switch off every few minutes.
Now, when you first approach where Mr. O'Keefe is on the ground, what, if any, sort of injuries, if at all, did you observe on Mr. O'Keefe at that time?
On the ground, I didn't observe any injuries or recall seeing any injuries at the time. It wasn't until I got him in the ambulance that I saw some injuries.
And so from that sort of initial assessment and initial sort of treatment of the patients, what exactly does that sort of assessment and treatment consist of when Mr. O'Keefe is on the ground?
Basically just checking for breathing and if he has a pulse. It was pretty dark and very low visibility, so we wanted to get him out of the conditions and into the ambulance to kind of further assess him.
And from your sort of initial assessment, did he have a pulse and was he breathing?
No.
And so want to get him out of the conditions, and how was that accomplished?
I believe we used a scoop board or scoop stretcher. It's just a backboard that breaks into 2 pieces. They can slide underneath the victim or the patient. We used that, and then we had picked him up and put him onto our actual EMS stretcher, and then just put the stretcher into the ambulance.
And where was the stretcher sort of placed in regard to where, or in relation to where Mr. O'Keefe was 5 feet off the road?
I don't recall.
Now, once you get to the ambulance, what, if any, difference did you notice between sort of the lighting in the ambulance versus the lighting outside on the lawn?
So there was very low visibility outside. There was great visibility inside with lighting all around the back of the ambulance.
And so once you're in the back of the ambulance, what, if anything, did you observe or know at that point in regard to any injuries you observed in Mr. O'Keefe?
He had like a swollen black and blue right eye, and he had some blood around his mouth.
Now, as far as Mr. O'Keefe was concerned, during treatment, you're touching or making contact with Mr. O'Keefe's body, correct?
Correct.
And during the course of that, what, if any, observations or what, if anything, did you note in regard to sort of tactile observations of Mr. O'Keefe?
He was very cold to touch, very stiff, almost frozen-like. Yeah.
Now, at some point during the course of your treatment in the back of the ambulance, are his clothes removed?
Yes.
And is that why? Is that?
It's just so we can try to examine his full body for any other injuries.
And there's some concern for cardiac arrest, correct?
Correct.
Can you explain, are you familiar with that term?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury what your understanding based on your training experience is as what is cardiac arrest?
Sure. It would be when a person has a lethal cardiac rhythm where they no longer have a pulse.
Now, once the clothes, as far as being removed, how were they physically, how were they removed?
I believe they were probably cut off with trauma shears.
And once the clothes are removed with trauma shears, what, if any, additional observations did you make of injuries to Mr. O'Keefe's body?
There were some lacerations on his right upper extremity.
Now, the chest compressions that you were talking about, was that continuous throughout the patient care with respect to Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes.
And in addition to that, what, if anything, was done with respect to body temperature for Mr. O'Keefe once in the back of the ambulance?
So we did some rewarming. So we did heat blankets and warm fluids.
And as the chest compressions continue in the back of the ambulance, what, if anything, did you observe with regard to Mr. O'Keefe's nose or mouth?
I remember that there was some blood or vomit or bile coming out of his mouth.
Now, turning your attention to back outside of the ambulance, taking you back there for a moment. You indicated in the testimony that when you arrived there, you observed 2 females in the area where Mr. O'Keefe was. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you describe anything as far as what they looked like or anything about those 2 females that you saw?
I just remember they were white, looked to be between 35 and 45 years old, I would say, and average build and height.
What, if any, distinguishing characteristic did you observe between one or the other?
I remember one had some red stuff around her mouth. I was thinking it could be blood.
And that individual that you observed with red stuff that you thought could be blood around the mouth, what, if any, observations did you make of her as far as her demeanor or anything like that?
She was just acting kind of erratic and kind of running around screaming different things.
And as far as the different things that she was screaming, what, if anything, do you recall specifically hearing her screaming when she was running around?
It was just something like, "He's dead, he's fucking dead."
Was that something that she said once or more than once or something else?
At least twice.
As far as that phraseology, was that consistent throughout?
I would say so, yes.
Now, when you enter the ambulance, does the patient care continue, obviously, with Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes.
And if you recall, who was involved in that patient care in the back of the ambulance?
Me, Nuttall, Flamati, Woodbury, Walsh, and McLaughlin came in a little bit later. I'm not sure if she did any patient care or not.
The majority of the people from your department that responded to the scene at one point or another were involved in patient care with regard to Mr. O'Keefe.
Correct.
Now, you drove the ambulance to Fairview, is that correct?
Correct.
And so for the transport from Fairview, what hospital did you go to?
Good Samaritan.
So the transport from Fairview to Good Samaritan, who drove the ambulance then?
McLaughlin.
And so firefighter McLaughlin's driving. Where are you located within the ambulance?
I was in the back with Nuttall and Flamati.
Do you recall specifically what, if anything, you were doing with regard to patient care during the transport phase?
So I was just helping them during the transport phase. I was doing compressions before, but we had switched them over to a automatic compression device. So I was just involved in helping ventilate and suction.
And were there who, if anyone else in the back of the ambulance was also working on the airway portion, do you recall?
I believe Nuttall, and I forget who else.
Now, during the course of transport from the scene when you arrived to Good Samaritan, what, if any, change did you note in reference to Mr. O'Keefe as far as heart activity, respiratory, anything of the like?
No changes.
Ms. Gilman, if I could ask for exhibit number 9, please. Firefighter Kelly, just directing your attention to the screen what's been marked as exhibit number 9. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
And where do you recognize that?
The location of the scene.
So the house that you responded to on January 29th, is that correct?
Correct.
And Ms. Gilman, if I could also have exhibit number 18. And again, sir, just directing your attention to the screen. Do you recognize the photograph that's up on the screen?
Yes.
What's depicted in that photograph?
The location of the scene, again.
Sort of a different view of the same home, is that correct?
Correct.
May I approach the witness, John?
Yes.
This is the laser pointer. Basically, there's a button there. Just press on that. Firefighter Kelly, with using that laser pointer that you have now before you, if you could, please direct the jury's attention on the screen to whereabouts you located Mr. O'Keefe in that supine position when you first arrived.
It was about this area right here.
Thanks. I have nothing further for this one.
All right, cross-examination?
Yes, may we approach for a minute your
Okay.
conversation?
Correct.
In or out of court?
Correct.
Now, with regard to the clothing that John O'Keefe was wearing when you came upon him, I believe you remembered that he had on a pair of jeans,
To the best of my recollection, yes.
and you remembered that he had a hoodie sweatshirt,
Yes.
and what also stuck out in your mind is that he had only one shoe on, correct?
Correct.
From your memory, you're not sure if it was the left or the right shoe, but it was one of those, correct?
Correct.
And you did not see another shoe or the matching shoe in the area anywhere around where he was lying, correct?
Correct.
And to your memory, you never saw that other shoe, correct?
Correct.
Now, with regard to the removal of the clothing, I believe you testified before this jury on direct examination that trauma shears would have been used. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And what do those look like? How big are they? And if you could describe them.
They're about this big, so say 6 inches, and they have usually like a plastic or metal handle, and then just kind of 2 curved blades that are used to cut.
And are they essentially a large pair of scissors?
Yes.
And are they sharp in terms of the blades?
Yes.
And they need to be somewhat heavy duty because you don't know what type of clothing you're going to have to cut through, correct?
Correct.
Where was it that the trauma shears were used in order to start to remove John O'Keefe's clothing that morning?
I don't recall.
Do you recall if it was before he was put into the ambulance, during the ambulance ride, or after he was at the hospital?
I believe it would, I don't recall, but I believe it would be in the ambulance.
I'm sorry, there's a little bit of noise. Could you repeat that?
Sure. I don't recall, but I believe it would be in the ambulance.
In the ambulance. And you wouldn't have waited until you got to the hospital because there was a reason why you were taking the clothing, correct?
Correct.
And what was that reason?
To look for any other injuries that the patient might have.
And that was a priority as you were treating him, correct?
Correct.
You don't think that you cut off his clothes before you put him in the ambulance, correct?
Correct.
And you don't think that, and when I say you, I mean your team.
Right.
You don't think your team cut off the clothes after he was out of the ambulance, correct?
Correct.
So it was sometime during the ride.
Correct.
Do you recall who it was that actually used the trauma shears along that ride?
No.
Do you recall at what point during the ride? Would it have been sort of the beginning of the ride, or would it have been toward the end?
Toward the beginning.
Now, with regard to the clothing that was cut, do you recall if it was the sweatshirt, the jeans, or both?
I don't recall.
Do you think, or is your memory that the hoodie sweatshirt was left on him without being cut?
I don't recall.
Where did that clothing go after it was cut by the trauma shears during that ride?
Some of it would stay right on the stretcher, but I don't recall on all of it.
Okay. And some of it could have been on the floor of the ambulance as well?
Potentially.
And then once the ambulance arrives at the hospital, what is the protocol regarding the clothing that had been cut?
It gets transferred over to the RN in charge of the patient and usually stays in their room. Usually they'll put it in some sort of bag.
Okay. And is the clothing put in the bag? Does somebody meet you out at the ambulance in order to collect the clothing, or do you bring the clothing into the hospital in order to transfer it to an RN?
We bring it in.
And do you recall who it was that brought in that clothing?
No.
Who was with you at that time going into the hospital from the ambulance?
Not all in Flamati.
So it had to be one of the three of you that delivered that clothing to an RN, correct?
Correct.
Do you know if all the clothing was delivered to an RN or if some stayed in the ambulance?
I don't recall.
And once you give the clothing to the RN, do you see where she takes it?
I don't recall.
Did you go into the treatment room wherever John O'Keefe was brought once he was at the hospital?
Yes.
And you had previously testified that you believe the clothing would have been brought in with him, correct?
Correct.
Do you have a memory of seeing that clothing within that treatment room at the hospital?
I don't recall.
Do you recall seeing the clothing on the floor?
I don't recall.
Okay. Now let's get back to when you first arrived on scene. And actually, but before I get to that, I did want to ask you a couple of questions about where you were at in terms of your career on January 28th, 29th. You were a fairly new firefighter?
Correct.
And you were conscious, you had been trained not long before January 29th, right? It was within several months?
2 months, yeah.
Oh, within 2 months, okay. And your priority as a new firefighter was to follow your training, correct?
Correct.
It was fresh in your mind.
Correct.
You wanted to do things the right way, correct?
Correct.
And particularly at the beginning of your career, you don't want to develop any bad habits, correct?
Correct.
And so you were following protocol once you got to the scene as best you could, correct?
Correct.
I believe you testified on direct examination that when the ambulance got to 34 Fairview, as soon as it was parked, you and Anthony Flamati went straight to the body, correct?
I don't recall saying that. I wasn't sure who went straight to the body. I said some of us got some supplies.
Okay. I thought your testimony, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought your testimony was that you may have gotten some supplies, but then you and Flamati went straight to the body.
Yeah, so we did, me and Nuttall.
Got supplies?
Me and Nuttall went to the body.
All right, where was
But we didn't go straight there. We got supplies first and then went to the body. Or I got supplies first and then went to the body.
Okay. How long did it take you to get supplies?
Probably within a minute, I would say.
Okay. And where was Flamati when you were getting supplies?
I don't recall.
Once you got to the body, who assisted you with regard to treating John O'Keefe?
I believe it would be the people who were on scene with me.
Who would that have been?
Flamati, Nuttall, Walsh, McLaughlin, Woodbury, and Robery.
Okay. So is it your testimony that your memory is that 5, 6, however many people were there with you, all were hovered over John O'Keefe doing treatment on him?
Not treatment, but getting supplies, getting the stretcher. We're all working together, but we weren't all doing the treatment portion.
Sure. And the treatment was essentially CPR, correct?
Correct.
Chest compressions?
Yes.
And dealing with his airway as well?
Correct.
Which of your coworkers and or you were directly involved with the CPR, the chest compressions, and the airway issues?
I recall that I was doing compressions and helping suction and ventilate in the ambulance, but I do not recall who else was partaking in that.
Okay. So let's talk about when John O'Keefe was put on the scoop stretcher and then ultimately taken to the ambulance. Who was with you when that was occurring?
So it would have been me, Nuttall, Flamati, and Robery, I believe, were trying to get him on the scoop. And then I believe the engine guys were trying to get the stretcher.
Who were the engine guys?
That would be Walsh. It must have been Walsh, Woodbury, and McLaughlin, but I don't recall who exactly was.
All right, so your memory is that yourself, Nuttall, and Flamati were loading John O'Keefe onto the scoop,
I believe so, yeah.
and then from the scoop he's put on a stretcher?
Correct.
And then who would it have been that wheeled the stretcher to the ambulance?
I don't recall who it was.
You?
I don't recall.
So you have no memory of who would have taken John O'Keefe on that stretcher into the back of the ambulance?
I don't recall who actually did it, but it would just be whoever's in the best location at the time to move the stretcher.
All right, do you have a memory of John O'Keefe going into the back of the ambulance?
Not a clear memory, no.
Who went into the ambulance with him?
Me, Nuttall, Flamati, Walsh, Woodbury.
Okay. And by the way, once he's on the scoop and then put on the stretcher, the priority is to get him into that ambulance, correct?
Correct.
And part of the reason for that is he was cold, correct?
Yes, sir.
And your priority was you wanted to warm him up, correct?
Correct.
And the best place to do that would have been the inside of that ambulance, correct?
Correct.
So it wasn't that he was put on the stretcher and then there was some detour in terms of where he was taken. You made or whoever took him, made a beeline for the back of that ambulance in order to get him warm, correct?
Correct.
And once he's in the ambulance, the priority at that point would be to close the doors of the ambulance, correct?
Correct.
Because if you leave the doors open, there's a blizzard outside, correct?
Objection.
Sustained. Let's go ahead, Ms. Dean. Keep moving forward, please.
And so the doors were closed to the ambulance, correct?
At some point, yes.
All right. And inside the doors of that ambulance, as you testified, was at least, not naming everybody, but at least you and Nuttall and Flamati, correct?
Correct.
And once those doors were closed to the ambulance, none of you left the ambulance, correct?
None of us, meaning?
I'm not talking specifically about you and Nuttall and Flamati.
I don't believe so.
No. You would have remained in the ambulance all the way to the hospital, and that's the point in which the doors would be open, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, I'd like to ask you some questions about the scene that you came upon in terms of the people who were there when you arrived, sir. You had previously testified that you saw, I believe you testified that you saw 2 women and a law enforcement officer already on scene, correct?
Correct.
One of those women appeared to have blood around her mouth, correct?
Correct.
It was something red, but you assumed that it was blood, correct?
Correct.
And that led you to also believe that she had rendered or tried to render CPR, correct?
Objection.
Is that what you thought?
Yes.
Okay.
And while you were on scene, it was the woman who had the blood around her mouth who appeared to be most upset, correct?
Correct.
She was really upset, correct?
Yes.
Would you go so far as to say she was distraught,
Yes.
hysterical,
Yes.
frantic?
Yes.
And you heard her say, he's dead, he's fucking dead, something like that, correct?
Correct.
And she didn't say it in the tone of voice that I just said it, correct?
Correct.
She was screaming when she said that, correct?
Correct.
It was very easy for you to discern that her words were, he's dead, he's fucking dead, correct?
Correct.
And she repeated it more than once, correct?
Correct.
And it's fair to say that at no point in time did you ever hear her say, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree with me, sir, that you have been extremely consistent in terms of your memory of what she said, correct?
Correct.
You've been asked these questions not for the first time by Mr. Lally or me in court today. There have been other occasions where people have asked you, what did the woman with the blood on her mouth say when she was on scene, correct?
Correct.
You were asked that by Trooper Proctor on February 9th of 2022, correct?
I don't recall.
It's probably unfair of me to say the date, but you do recall speaking to a state trooper not long after these incidents, correct?
Correct.
And to that state trooper, you told him that what she said was, he's dead, he's fucking dead, correct?
I don't recall.
You don't recall saying anything differently than that, do you?
I remember saying a lot differently, but I might have also said that. I just don't recall.
Well, you don't, let me rephrase that. You don't recall changing her words at all. You recall, you've always said he's dead, he's fucking dead, correct?
Correct.
That was not only to the state police on February 9th, but then in April of 2022, you were in a grand jury setting, correct?
Correct.
There was no defense attorney there on that day, correct?
I don't believe so.
You don't remember seeing me there?
No, I didn't see that.
Mr. Lally was asking you the questions, correct?
Correct.
And there, you also said that what the woman with the blood on her mouth said was, he's dead, he's fucking dead, correct?
Correct.
And you've testified to that today.
Yes, sir.
You've never changed that story, correct?
Correct.
And that is because the truth does not change, correct?
Correct.
All right, at this point, I'd like to play a 15-second portion of a video, which I would offer as the next exhibit, Your Honor.
Okay, so we'll watch it and then you can
Thank you
offer
very
it.
much.
With no narration, right?
Never. And before you start, I'm not as interested in the video, sir. I'm interested in the audio. So if you could, listen as best you can.
Sure.
Do you have a problem? Did you what? Did you what? Huh?
Would you agree with me, sir, that we heard what you heard that night, which is he's dead, he's fucking dead?
It was kind of hard for me to hear.
Okay.
I heard about, does he do drugs? I couldn't really hear the background.
I made a moment.
Okay.
May we approach?
Okay.
So again, and by the way, before it's queued up, I would direct your attention more toward the beginning of that 15 seconds. As there are things that happen, I think, that you heard at the end, but you tell us if you can hear, or what you can hear.
Okay.
Do you have a problem? Did you what? Did you what? Huh?
What did you hear?
I heard someone say fucking dead.
Thanks.
Okay. Any redirect?
Just briefly on. Mr. Kelly, from that video that was just up on the screen, you indicated that when you got to the scene, you saw the cruiser and parked sort of behind the cruiser, correct?
Around the cruiser, yeah.
So from that video, you didn't see the ambulance that you were driving anywhere in, correct?
Correct.
You have no idea whether or not you were even on scene at that time that any of those statements that were made in that video were made, correct?
Correct.
Now, as far as patient care was concerned, were sort of all of you, being yourself, firefighter Flamati, firefighter Nuttall, firefighter McLaughlin, firefighter Walsh, firefighter Woodbury, were you all together all the time, or were you doing separate things in separate places during the course of your time on scene?
Separate things in separate places, yeah.
So fair to say that everything that you heard may not be everything that someone else that was there from your department that day heard, correct?
Correct.
And conversely, something that someone else heard may not be necessarily something that you were in a position to hear that day, correct?
Correct.
You also asked some questions about sort of using the shears and cutting off Mr. O'Keefe's clothing during the ride. Is it your testimony that that was in the back of the ambulance, correct?
Correct.
And was that during the transport, or was that prior? Would you be utilizing shears on a patient, cutting off clothing while the ambulance is in transit?
No.
Okay. So if it was in the back of the ambulance, that would have been prior to the ambulance leaving the scene and going to the Samaritan, correct?
Correct.
Nothing.
Your Honor, the only thing I would offer is the video that I played. I have
All right, so we will do that.
Thank
So, Mr. Clerk, it's already been pre-marked, right? Do you not have it, Nancy? Okay. Okay, whenever you're ready, Mr. Lally.
Thanks, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Could you please state your name and spell your last name?
Francis Walsh, W-A-L-S-H.
And what do you do for it, sir?
I'm a lieutenant paramedic with the Canton Fire Department.
And how long have you been a firefighter paramedic with the Canton Fire Department?
Just shy of 10 years.
And you indicated that you have the rank of lieutenant, is that correct?
That's correct.
How long have you been a lieutenant with Canton?
Since September of last year.
Now, with regards to, you have certifications both as an EMT and a paramedic, correct?
That's correct.
And with regard to those certifications, when was it first that you sort of received those?
I received my paramedic certification in June of 2014. That's when I was officially certified.
And is that something that you've been subject to sort of continuing educational components and recertification since then?
Yes, yeah, every 2 years we have to recertify and take continuing education classes.
And is your certification up to speed at this point?
Yeah, it's current. I just recertified last month, actually.
Now, if I could turn your attention to the evening of January 28th into January 29th, 2022. Do you recall that day?
I do.
And were you working that day with the firefighter?
I was.
And what kind of shift were you working on that occasion?
24-hour shifts, which is standard.
And is that 8 a.m. to 8 a.m.?
That's correct.
So that, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would be 8 a.m. on the 28th until 8 a.m. on the 29th?
That's correct.
And so where were you assigned to on that particular day?
I was assigned to headquarters, which is on 99 Revere Street, and my position was engine driver.
So fair to say people within your department get different sort of assignments on different apparatus based on the different shift that they work.
That's correct.
And your assignment that day was the driver of the engine?
Correct, yes, engine 3.
Now, beyond sort of your assignment as the engine driver on that particular shift, what, if any, sort of specialized assignment do you have, or did you have at that time in regard to snow removal?
Yeah, so on that particular shift, I was also the snowplow driver. We have an in-house truck and a snowplow for the fire department, and that was my responsibility on that shift.
How many people within your department have that sort of responsibility when it comes to it?
It kind of depends group to group. So some working groups will just kind of rotate and have a different person do it each time. At that time, the group that I was on, I kind of had the most experience plowing, so I was always the go-to person to be in the plow truck when it snowed.
And so with respect to that duty, about what time did you sort of get up on that morning of the 29th?
I believe it was around 4 a.m.
And why was it that you got up at that time?
It was snowing pretty heavily. I mean, we knew the forecast called for a lot of snow, so I got up early and hopped in the plow truck.
And so, just briefly, in addition to the snow, what, if anything else, did you observe as far as the weather conditions when you were out in the plow truck?
It was very windy. Just windy and really heavy snow.
Now, at some point, shortly after 6 a.m., does your department get dispatched to a call?
Yes.
And where was the dispatch to, and what was it in regard to?
So I didn't hear the actual dispatch because I was in the plow truck. I was in the rear of headquarters in the plow truck. But my Captain Robery, came out and told me that we had a call for 34 Fairview Road for an unresponsive male party. And he told me, to hop in the engine and head to that call.
And when you hop in the engine, who, if anyone else from your department, was assigned to the same engine as you on that day?
So I had Lieutenant Woodbury to my right in the passenger seat and Firefighter McLaughlin in the rear.
And beyond the engine that you were driving, what, if any, sort of other apparatus from your department was dispatched to the call that day as well?
So that would have been Ambulance 1, and then also Car 5 went as well. That's kind of like an optional thing, but with a call of that severity, the captain will go as well.
And who was in Car 5 on that day?
Captain Robery.
And you drove the engine, is that correct?
That's correct.
If you could describe to the jury sort of what you observed as far as the road conditions, visibility, things of that like en route from the station to Fairview Road.
Yeah, so it was really, really poor driving conditions and visibility. I can't recall ever driving to a call of that nature and that severity that slowly. The visibility was so poor that we were just driving extremely slow.
Siren's so further away. Okay. And if you could describe to the jury sort of the route of travel that you took from Station 1 to Fairview.
Sure. So out of Station 1, take a right onto Revere Street, and then a left onto Sherman Street, a right onto Chapman Street, and then a left onto Fairview.
Now, if you recall, what was sort of the order? You're all sort of dispatching, you're all sort of responding around the same time, being Car 5, the ambulance, and the engine, correct?
Correct.
And if you recall, what was sort of the order of the vehicles in response?
So Engine 3, we were the last vehicle for the fire department to arrive on scene. So when we arrived on scene, Ambulance 1 and Car 5 were already on scene.
And if I could ask just sort of, as you're turning onto Fairview Road and you travel down, what, if anything, do you know about sort of the elevation of the roadway as you're driving down to it?
It's a downhill grade. Yeah, it gets a little bit steep at one point.
And the residence that you eventually stopped at or responded to, where was that in location in reference to when you first turn on to Fairview? About how far down is the residence that you eventually go?
Pretty far down. I believe it's one of the last houses on Fairview.
And the residence that we're talking about is, from your perspective, when you're driving down there, is that on your left or right or something else?
Left.
And as you're approaching the scene, what is it sort of that you see before you? As how do you know where to stop and where you're going?
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, visibility was really poor. But there was Ambulance 1, Car 5, at least a couple of police cruisers on scene before us. So it's kind of hard to miss that. So that's how we knew where to stop.
Now, in regard to you're responding to an unresponsive male, correct?
Correct.
And just to be clear, at some point you were able to identify, or you were told what the identity was of that unresponsive male patient, correct?
That's correct.
And what was his name?
John O'Keefe.
And so with respect to Mr. O'Keefe, as you're approaching the scene, when was the first time that you were able to sort of see where Mr. O'Keefe was on scene when you arrived?
It wasn't until a little bit after we actually arrived on scene that I could see the patient, because as we pulled up, the ambulance was blocking our line of sight to where the patient was, so I couldn't see him right away.
And what was sort of the I know you talked about visibility, but as far as had the sun come up yet?
No, it was pitch black.
And so when you arrive on scene, what is it that you and sort of the other people on your engine are doing in relation to patient treatment?
So at that point, I got out of the engine and I started walking towards where the ambulance crew was. But at that point, Firefighter McLaughlin was coming around to the rear of the ambulance to get the stretcher out. So I went directly to that to give her a hand with that. And we proceeded to bring that around the front of the ambulance where Firefighter Nuttall, Flamati and Kelly, and I believe Captain Robery were working on the patient.
Now, in reference to where patient Mr. O'Keefe was, where was he? Could you see sort of how, in reference to the ground?
I could see the other firefighters and captain that I just mentioned had just put him on the backboard at the first time that I saw him. I'd say that was like roughly 10 feet in from the road.
And to that point, how were you able to say that it was approximately 10 feet in from the road?
Just an estimate.
Let me ask you, as far as the stretcher was concerned that you and firefighter McLaughlin retrieved, where did you place that in relation to where Mr. O'Keefe was when you first arrived over?
So we placed that. We decided to leave it on the street and get it as close to the grass or snow as possible. It was unspoken, but we knew that we didn't want to put the stretcher onto the snow because it would be too unstable. So we put it right up against the curb, so right at the edge of the street where the street meets the yard.
And so you put the stretcher basically right up against the curb, and Mr. O'Keefe was approximately 10 feet from that.
That's correct.
And with respect to positioning the stretcher, was that parallel with the curb or perpendicular to it, or how was it?
Parallel.
And you mentioned that obviously Mr. O'Keefe is on scene, and there are a number of different firefighters from your department, correct?
That's correct.
There was at least a police cruiser. Did you see any officers sort of around the scene?
Yes, I remember Officer Saraf and Sergeant Good.
And with respect to civilians, what if any civilians did you observe around the scene as well?
I observed 2 female civilians.
And where were they in relation to where you were, or in relation to where Mr. O'Keefe was?
I mean, they were pretty worked up, so they were moving around quite a bit. But I'd say they were somewhere in between myself and the stretcher and where Mr. O'Keefe was.
And did you yourself have any conversation with either of the 2 females that you saw?
I did not directly, no.
And you just testified a little bit before that they were upset. Is it so that both of them were?
Yes.
And what, if anything, leads you to that sort of conclusion as far as their demeanor? What, if anything, did you specifically observe?
I mean, I observed one of them like screaming and crying, and they were both just frantically like moving around a lot.
As far as the one that you observed screaming or crying, do you recall specifically what, if anything, that person said?
All I recall her saying was, "Is he alive?"
Now, with respect to Mr. O'Keefe, as far as his clothes, what, if any, observations did you make of his clothes?
The notable observation that I made was that he was missing one shoe, his right shoe.
And where was Mr. O'Keefe when you made that observation of missing one shoe?
It was when we put the stretcher into the ambulance. The stretcher lifts up, so it's kind of right at my face, and that's when I noticed it.
So at the time he was being placed in the ambulance, you only had one shoe based on what you saw.
That's correct.
Now, once Mr. O'Keefe is in the back of the ambulance, where did you go?
So I stayed down at the feet. I was positioned right by his right leg.
And what, if any, difference did you know between sort of the lighting conditions outside on the lawn versus the lighting conditions in the back of the ambulance?
In the back of the ambulance, it was dramatically better.
And so once in the back of the ambulance, what, if anything, did you note or observe as far as injuries to Mr. O'Keefe?
I noticed a hematoma on his right eye, and I noticed some blood coming from his nose.
And just to be clear for the record, so when you say hematoma, based on your training experience, can you explain what your understanding of that term is to the jury?
Swelling and bruising.
Now, at some points, with respect to the clothing that Mr. O'Keefe was wearing, what, if anything, did you or other firefighters or paramedics from your department do with reference to Mr. O'Keefe's clothing?
We removed all of his clothing.
And let me first ask, how was that removal sort of accomplished?
Can you repeat that?
When you removed his clothing, how did you do that?
Oh, with trauma shears, basically scissors that cut clothing.
And once sort of, was that pursuant to some sort of protocol, or
Yes.
why was the clothing removed?
On any trauma call, it's protocol to expose the patient so you can see all injuries and you don't miss any injuries.
And once the clothing was removed with the trauma shears, what, if any, additional injuries or anything did you observe?
I noticed some scratches and lacerations on his right arm.
Now, in reference to treatment in the back of the ambulance with regard to Mr. O'Keefe, what, if any, sort of role in that did you sort of assume, or were you sort of assigned by the lead paramedic?
Yeah, so I was responsible for the IO drill and access. It's an intraosseous access.
Can you explain to the jury sort of what that is and how that's accomplished?
Yeah, so you do that instead of IV access. So when somebody's in cardiac arrest, it's really hard to get an IV. So what you do is you actually drill into a bone, and you can administer medication and fluids like into the bone marrow space.
And so pursuant to, so Mr. O'Keefe was undergoing cardiac arrest, correct?
Correct.
Could you explain your understanding of that term based on your training experience to the jury? What is cardiac arrest?
There's no cardiac function. His heart isn't pumping blood anymore.
And so what, if any, sort of protocols are there as far as medication administration is there in reference to a cardiac arrest?
Yeah, so the frontline medication for that is epinephrine. That's what we gave through the IO access.
What is the purpose of the epinephrine?
Epinephrine, I mean, basically in layman's terms, it gets the heart pumping again, if that's a viable option.
And in addition to the epinephrine, what, if any, other medication was administered through the IO?
I believe that was it. As far as when I was on scene, it was just epinephrine.
Do you recall anything about salines?
Oh, yeah, saline as well, but, it's not a medication. But, yeah, we also administered saline.
What is the purpose of the same?
Saline is just to increase blood volume.
Now, as far as the transport, Mr. O'Keefe has been taken from Seattle Hospital, correct?
Correct.
Did you go along with the ambulance on the transport to the hospital?
I did not.
So you remained on scene at least for some period of time, correct?
Very briefly, but yes.
And you referenced some officers from the Canton Police Department that were on scene when you were on scene, correct?
Correct.
And without reference to anything that was said, which of them, if any, did you have any conversation with prior to leaving the scene?
Sergeant Good.
And just as far as what you told Sergeant Good, what, if anything, did you relay to him before you left the scene?
I relayed to him that there were signs of trauma in the patient.
And did you give any sort of further explanation as to what signs of trauma that you observed?
Yes, I believe I told him what I told you about the hematoma on the eye and the blood in the nose and the scratches and lacerations on the arm.
So you told Sergeant Good what you just testified to this jury that you observed?
I believe so.
Ms. Gilman, if I could ask for exhibit number 18. And Firefighter Walsh, what's up on the screen is exhibit 18. Do you recognize that?
Yes, 34 Fairview Road.
Is that a fair, minus whatever the weather conditions are, fair and accurate portrayal of what you observed that day at 34 Fairview?
Yes.
May I approach the witness just briefly?
Yes.
So this is again stated.
Okay.
And so, Firefighter Walsh, if I could ask, using that laser pointer, if you could direct the jury's attention to where within this photograph did you see that you observed Mr. O'Keefe's body when you first arrived?
Right in that general area.
Thanks. May I have one moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
No further questions for this witness, Your Honor.
All right. Cross-examination?
Yes.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
I just want to ask you about the woman that you saw on scene who appeared to be screaming and crying. Would you agree with me that she stood out to you because she appeared to be the most upset
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yes.
and the loudest?
Yes.
She appeared to be crying more than others,
Yes.
and she was screaming, right?
Yes.
And what you heard her say, I understand your testimony, was that she just said, "Is he alive?" Correct?
That's what I recall. Correct.
In a loud voice,
Yes.
in a distraught voice,
Yes.
while she was crying.
Correct.
I have nothing further.
There's nothing, Mr. Lally, right?
No.
All right, you are all set, sir.
Good afternoon. Could you please state your name and spell your last name, please?
It's Katie McLaughlin, McLaughlin.
And what do you do for work, ma'am?
I'm a firefighter paramedic for the town of Canton.
And how long have you been a firefighter paramedic in town?
Probably about 7 years at this point.
And prior to working for the Canton Fire Department, what, if any, other work did you do sort of within that general field?
I worked as an EMT basic for Brewster Ambulance. Went to paramedic school. I eventually became a paramedic for Brewster Ambulance, and I worked there for a few years before getting on the fire department.
And just briefly, but prior to becoming a paramedic or working as a paramedic, what if any sort of training did you receive in regard, or certification did you receive in regard to being a paramedic?
So it's a 2-year schooling where you have about a year of didactic. There's a lecture portion for about a year, and then after that, there's about a year to a year and a half of clinical training that's done in an ER and then done in an ambulance. So that whole period is around 2 years.
And prior to working in the Canton Fire Department, you received certification from the state or some other sources being a paramedic, correct?
Yes, it's through the state and through a national registry.
And both those certifications through the state and the national registry, are those granted sort of forever, or is there like a continuing educational component and a recertification process?
So you recertify every 2 years. You have to take continuing education classes in that 2-year period, and that's just on a 2-year cycle you recertify.
And your certification is up to date at this point, is that correct?
Yes.
Ma'am, if I could turn your attention to the dates of January 28th, 2022 into January 29th, 2022. Do you recall those dates?
Yes.
And were you working with the Canton Fire Department on those dates?
Yes.
Do you recall what kind of shift you were working from the 28th to the 29th?
It was just my regular 24-hour shift.
And 24-hour shift in Canton Fire is essentially 8 a.m. to 8 a.m., is that correct?
Correct.
And where were you sort of assigned within the town of Canton Fire Department on that day?
So I was on the engine for that shift. So I was the third person on the engine. There's an engine driver, there's an officer, and then there's a third person who's in the back.
And so your sort of role with respect to the engine, is there sort of like a name for that position?
Some people call it like the backstep. Yeah.
And which station house were you assigned to on that engine 3 day?
The Station 1, which is 99 Revere Street.
And in addition to yourself, who, if anyone else, was assigned to the other sort of two roles on the engine?
Frank Walsh was the engine driver that day, and Greg Woodbury was the lieutenant on the engine that day.
Now, turning your attention to that morning of the 29th, do you recall about what time you got up or what time you went outside that day?
I think we were up maybe a little before 6 because it was snowing, and we had to like shovel the front apron. So we were up maybe 5 a.m.
And so when you were up around that time, around 5 a.m. and outside, you were outside shoveling, is that correct?
Yep. Intermittently.
Sorry?
Intermittently, yeah.
So during the times that you were outside shoveling, what, if anything, did you observe as far as the weather or conditions at that point?
It was snowing pretty heavily. It had been snowing. We were shoveling, and it was pretty cold and windy.
And if you know around that time that you initially sort of went out and were shoveling, about how much snow had accumulated at that point?
I don't know how much. I mean, enough for us to shovel that front apron, but I don't know how much.
Now, sometime shortly after 6 a.m., were you and other members of your department dispatched to a call?
Yes.
And where were you dispatched to, and what was that dispatch in regard to?
So the call came in as a man down in the snow or a man unresponsive in the snow, and the call was 434 Fairview Road.
And about how long was it from the time that you sort of received that dispatch and go sort of on the engine to that residence on Fairview Road?
How long? We're on the truck and going probably within a few minutes at most.
And so in addition to yourself and Firefighter Walsh and Lieutenant Woodbury, what, if any, other sort of apparatus from your station was dispatched to this call for?
The ambulance was dispatched as well, and I believe the command car 5, also was dispatched to the call.
And as far as car 5, if you recall, who was in car 5?
At the time, Captain Robery.
And with respect to the ambulance, if you know who, if anyone, was assigned to the ambulance and went with the ambulance that day?
Firefighter Kelly and Firefighter Flamati were on that ambulance, and I believe Tim Nuttall was also there. He came in early, and so he jumped on the ambulance as well.
And with respect to when you get to Fairview Road, do you recall what sort of order the vehicles were in as far as car 5, the ambulance, and the fire engine?
I think car 5 was maybe first, and then the ambulance was in front of us, and then we pulled up behind the ambulance.
And so when you sort of arrive on scene and pull up behind the ambulance, other than vehicles from your department, what, if any, other sort of vehicles did you observe or see on scene that day?
I noticed there were multiple police vehicles and at least one civilian vehicle.
Now, obviously, you're responding to a report of an unresponsive male, correct?
Yes.
And when you're sort of first arriving on scene, or just in reference to when you arrived on scene, when was the first time that you were able to see that unresponsive party?
So when I got out of the engine, I went right back to the ambulance to get the stretcher because I knew that from wherever they were, they seemed to be kind of in off of the road. So I got the stretcher with Firefighter Walsh, I believe, and then we brought the stretcher as close as we could to the patient, and that was like parallel to the curb, and that would be the first time that I observed them working on a patient.
And so if I could just ask you, just with regard to sort of those duties as the backstep person, so what is sort of the duties and responsibilities of the backstep person on the engine to this kind of medical?
So the role of the person in the back of the engine is, it kind of is dependent upon what that lead paramedic needs you to do. You're there to assist the ambulance in any way that they need. So that could be assisting with extrication of a patient. It could be obtaining information about a patient or bystanders. It could be assisting with patient care if they need you in the back of the ambulance. It really depends on what they need you to do for that particular call.
And turning back to your testimony just a moment ago, you said moreover rendering sort of patient care. Is that correct?
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
I noted Tim. I noted Tony, and there were a lot of people that seemed to be around that area. So I'm not sure exactly who else was there, but I did note Tony and Tim were in that area.
So as far as sort of the other people in that area where Tony and Tim were, so people sort of beyond people from your department, what, if any, other sort of people did you notice around that area?
I don't know specifically. What do you mean, like
as far as,
outside of the?
Right. So outside of fire department personnel in that area, what, if any, observations did you make of those people? Who were those people?
Well, at that point, I couldn't really make out like the identities of like other people. I noted Tim and Tony, but I didn't really pick up on who anyone else was at that point.
So
they were still like in off of the road at that point.
And so from where they're positioned with regard to the patient, and just for clarity purposes, you were subsequently learning the identity of the patient, correct?
Yes.
And who did you learn him to be?
John O'Keefe.
And where you and firefighter Walsh were with the stretcher, how far away from where you were was Mr. O'Keefe and the other firefighter?
They were, I don't know that I could give a number, several feet away. They were like, I remember kind of seeing a fire hydrant, but I don't know exactly number-wise what that would be.
And from your observation of where Mr. O'Keefe was, could you tell how his body was positioned?
He was supine, so he was lying on his back or face up.
And what, if anything, by the time that you arrived with firefighter Walsh on the stretcher, what, if anything, could you see that firefighters Lamati and or Nuttall or anyone else was doing with reference to Mr. O'Keefe?
By that point, it seemed like they had already got him pretty much secured on a backboard, and they were ready to move him to the stretcher.
And once Mr. O'Keefe is then moved with the backboard from where he was to the stretcher where you are, what happened then?
So I remember Tony was kind of at the head of the stretcher. I was standing on the side. There was a woman next to me, and Tony said to me, "Can you try to figure out what happened?" And he kind of motioned to this woman that was next to me.
And so firefighter Lamati, who's the lead paramedic, directed you to ask questions of this female, correct?
Yes.
And it's fair to say this woman that was next to you, you didn't know her, you never met her before.
No.
From your conversations with her that day, do you see that woman in the courtroom today?
Yes.
Can you just direct us to where she's seated or an article of clothing she's wearing? That's record reflect identification identified with the term.
Okay.
Now, with respect to this woman, she's standing next to you when you're at the side of the stretcher, correct?
Yes.
And what, if any, observations did you sort of initially make as far as her demeanor, or how was she sort of acting when you first started to engage?
She seemed very upset. Very upset.
And when you say she seemed very upset, what about her did you observe that made you say that?
Just her facial expressions. She was just visibly distraught.
And so as far as your questions, what type of questions are you asking, or what type of information are you looking for from this person?
So just basic demographic info, who the patient is, his name, his date of birth. And then as far as any more questioning, you're trying to gather information that would basically help explain how this person ended up in the scenario that they're in. So did he have any medical problems? Does he take any medications daily? Does he have any allergies to medications? I was asking those questions.
And as you're asking those questions, what, if anything, is the defendant Ms. Reed doing while you're asking those questions?
She answered who the patient was, his birthday. I think she answered maybe some of those initial medical questions that I asked. But as I said, she's very distraught. She was kind of moving around the scene a little bit. So I was just kind of following her. And then we came to a stop at one point, and I continued to ask one more question.
What was that one more question?
So at that point, I asked her if there had been any significant trauma that happened before this.
What, if anything, did she say?
So she said, "I hit him." She repeated it. There was a woman standing across from her who I believe at that point said, "You're hysterical. You need to calm down. You're hysterical." She repeated, "I hit him." And there was a police officer who was in that vicinity kind of with us who replied, "You what?" She repeated it one more time. And that officer then signaled to somebody, "Get Goody down here," which I'm assuming would be the sergeant.
So when you have this conversation, if you recall, you mentioned that the other person who was across from you was just, was that somebody from your department, or an officer, or a civilian, or who was that?
So I was standing, Karen Reed was to my right. There was another woman to the left of me, kind of across from her. And then there was a police officer kind of, not directly across from me, but within the same kind of area that was more closer to Karen, I would say.
Do you know who that officer was?
I don't.
Do you know who the female or civilian person that was across from you? Do you know what that person's name is?
No.
And with respect to when Ms. Reed said this repeatedly, "I hit it," can you describe to the jury sort of the tonality of that? How did she say it?
She was very, very upset. She seemed hysterical, I would even say. Just very upset.
But once you received that information, did you follow up with any other questions to Ms. Reed at that point?
At that point, I did not. I have to drive the ambulance, so it's a time-sensitive situation. So I knew I had to drive the ambulance. it was said in the presence of the police officer, so I felt like that was the appropriate, that information was appropriately transferred, and I just felt, based on her demeanor, I don't think it would have been productive for me to continue to ask her questions at that point.
And so after asking and receiving that answer, if I hit him, where did you go?
So I went to the ambulance.
And in reference to the ambulance, did you go to the back of the ambulance, front of the ambulance? Where did you go?
So I went to the back of the ambulance where the patient care was happening.
And as far as the information that you had received from the defendant, did you relay that information to any of the other firefighters from your department in the back of the ambulance?
I did.
And you recall who was there in the back of the ambulance when you relayed that?
Tony was there, Tim, I think maybe Firefighter Kelly, Firefighter Walsh maybe might have been in there at that point.
Now, as far as when you get to the back of the ambulance, what, if anything, did you do with reference to assist or help as far as patient care with regards to Mr. O'Keefe?
I didn't assist or partake in any patient care.
Now, prior to putting Mr. O'Keefe into the back of the ambulance and prior to your conversation with the defendant, what, if any, observations had you made during the brief time that you were on the side of the stretcher of Mr. O'Keefe and any injuries you observed?
I noted he had injuries to his face. I noticed some blood from his nose, from his mouth, and most notably, he had some swelling to his eyes, mostly the right eye, and a laceration above the right eye.
And same as far as when you went to the back of the ambulance to relay the information that you had been asked to obtain. What, if any, injuries did you observe with Mr. O'Keefe once he was back?
Oh, I'm sorry. I observed those injuries in the back of the ambulance. I didn't observe those injuries while he was out on the stretcher. I didn't get a good look at him.
So you really hadn't got a good look until
Right.
back.
Right.
Now, as far as you indicated, you drove the ambulance from Fairview. Where did you go to?
Good Samaritan Hospital.
And as you were driving that ambulance along the roads from Canton to Brockton, what, if anything, did you note as far as visibility, road conditions, things like that?
There was poor visibility. The roads weren't plowed yet, so it took probably longer than usual based on the conditions.
And I apologize, but if I can take you just a step back further for a moment. Just in reference to when you're in the back of the ambulance, you indicated the injuries that you observed. What, if any, observations did you make as far as the clothing that Mr. O'Keefe was wearing?
I noted that he was wearing jeans. I noticed a lighter, like a black zip-up jacket or sweatshirt. It was like a lighter jacket. I noticed he had one sneaker on, and that was it.
Do you recall which foot the sneaker was on?
I don't.
All right, could I see counsel for a second, please?
A couple of things about the view. Please dress comfortably. I really appreciate everybody's dressing respectfully for court, but wear comfortable shoes at least for tomorrow. So those 3 cautions, please do not discuss this case with anyone. Don't do any independent research or investigation into the case. If you happen to see, hear, or read anything about the case, please disregard it and let us know. And for the view, I'll give you some preliminary instructions on that just before we leave. Okay, so we'll see you tomorrow. And tomorrow's a full day.